Hi, my name's Stefan and I had the Tjiabou Cultural Center by Renzo Piano as my sculptural study for the Nature Materials project. Designs for this project began in 1991 in a design competition that inevitably saw Renzo Piano win. The construction process began in 1993 with the building being officially inaugurated in 1998, named after Jean-Marie Tjiabou, the New Caledonian independence leader who sought after a cultural center that recognized the heritage of the Kanak people. He was unfortunately assassinated in 1988, and the structure is named in his honor. Renzo Piano was inspired by the vernacular architecture of the Kanak people, and his goal with the project was to create a symbol of pacification between the Kanaks and the French colonials, ultimately unifying these two cultures through the structure and the articulation of materials. A cluster of pavilions ranging in 3 different sizes. The Tjiabou Cultural Center is inspired by the grand cases, the huts that the Kanak people made as their architecture. These huts were cone-shaped and made from local materials that were often torn down and reshaped depending on the season and the particular weather. Watching a series of interviews on piano in the duration of the semester, one thing became very prominent to me. His awareness of his surroundings and his ability to appreciate and to take into consideration other cultures and their values. He really drives home this point, encouraging young people studying architecture not to travel and really see the world so their perspective can just continuously expand, that being their perspective on the world. So knowing this made me realize how important it was for Renzo Piano to recognize the cultural values of the Kanak people in the center. And so his design uses a palette of materials that are mandatory in the structure that he envisioned, whilst being able to pay attention to the Kanak people and their construction methods and, again, articulation of materials. So the Cultural Center intentionally has this sort of unfinished aesthetic to it. This kind of symbolizes the continuation of the culture of the Kanak people. He used aluminum, steel, glass, and Iroko wood imported from Africa as the primary components and materials for his design, and integrated them in such a way that they were able to symbolize the initial concept of unifying the two cultures. In the picture shown, you can see these long vertical wooden beams that are intersected by rows of steel beams, articulating again that intertwinement in the facade. This also tied into this idea of sustainable design. This practice allowed for natural airflow to take place as the cooling system rather than relying on mechanical systems, as the center is bordered on 3 sides by bodies of water. As for my sculptural study in particular, I began sketching as soon as my research was done and went through several iterations, initially coming up with this idea of articulating this pacification of the two cultures through the materiality by separating them on 2 sides with this plexiglass box filled with water intersecting them, sort of symbolizing the ocean. On one side, we have a total expression of wood, sort of symbolizing past traditions and in particular the Kanak people and their construction methods, while on the other side we have a more modern interpretation expressed through more, I guess you can say, contemporary construction materials such as the concrete and metal frames. These two would unify over the water, representing again that unification of the two cultures over this big separator, this body of water, the ocean. But after careful consideration and speaking with Professor Jane, I realized this idea was just too obvious. As much as I liked it, it really was too obvious and a bit trite. And so it required a bit more thinking to really execute it the way I wanted to. So the second picture here shows the model derivative of this sketch. It's essentially the second design. I got rid of that plexiglass border and made the sculpture a bit more unified, really deploying this idea of integration of materials, symbolizing these two cultures in a more dignified approach. However, again, I realized further that I just wasn't quite there yet, and the 2 solid pieces of the box and concrete didn't really hold any particular value and didn't help this idea of airflow that Piano expressed in the Cultural Center. So this brings me to my third and final design, the sculpture itself. I decided that to truly symbolize the idea of integration, I need to unify the 2 opposing elements from the beginning. To begin, the sculpture sits on an open space. It sits in the outdoors. Piano took into consideration the extroverted nature of the Kanak people, and their culture, and just how much their culture enjoyed the outdoors. So the pavilions on the north side are very open, allowing for outdoor activities to take place. So it really didn't make sense for me to place the sculpture inside in an enclosed manner. It was imperative that it was placed outdoors. We see the intertwinement sprouting immediately from the ground. The roots and metal wires symbolize the integration of two adjacent cultures, the Kanaks and the French colonials, and their cultural roots, no pun intended, interweaving as they progress through the final form. The metal pole functions as the spine of the center. The cluster of pavilions that sit in the Tjiabou Culture Center sit on a spine that takes the shape of the coastline, and so I use the spine concept in a vertical manner that everything would weave in and out of, begin and end at. Looking into the sculpture in the south direction, we see a mirror, and this mirror represents Piano's recognition of the surrounding environment and culture, as the mirror reflects not only the intertwinement of materials, but again, the surrounding environment as well. Sprouting through the top of this galvanized pole, we see the roots of these tree branches that I placed. These roots represent the Kanak people and how they ultimately shone through in the design thinking of the cultural center. So this essentially just represents the complete recognition of the Kanak people and their ideas that inherently dominate the ethos of the design and their imperative place in the cultural center. The intertwinement is further symbolized through the diverse methods in the ways that I put the materials together. This gasket clamp locks the wooden frame to the spine, just adding another layer to this idea of intertwinement. The metal frames are welded together in a rather seamless manner, sort of paying tribute to the exquisite detail in which Piano put his projects together and how well he paid attention to detail. And again, although I'm not like a master welder or metal worker by practice, I really wanted to express this in this specific manner rather than strictly relying on using screws and bolts to put the metal pieces together. And if you see the overall silhouette, these, I guess, planar shapes and perpendicular forms intersect not only together in the sculpture, but outside of the sculpture. Something that I've really explored this semester is using visual aids outside of the initial, I guess, drawing or study of my designs. So at some points, all of these planes intersect visually outside of the sculpture itself. And that was imperative for me to put as another layer to sort of articulate that intertwinement, and again tying back to that concept of this unification of two adjacent cultures. So this pretty much concludes my presentation, and that's it. Peace.